possiamo cominciare i nostri lavori in questa prima sessione, in questa prima tornata, nella quale avremo qualche saluto iniziale, poi una lezione di apertura di David Jacobi, una pausa per il caffè e poi l'inizio dei lavori ordinari con le relazioni di Jean-Claude Ocquet e Piero Falchetta. Prima di iniziare permettetemi di dire due parole, anzitutto di dare il benvenuto. Dare il benvenuto a chi già ci conosce, agli amici che tornano e a chi ci incontra per la prima volta. E devo dire anche per chi ancora non ci conosce due parole sull'Istituto Veneto, su cosa sia questa vecchia accademia, un'accademia diciamo di età non giovane, nata in età napoleonica, passata attraverso la fase di Napoleone, poi quella del governo austriaco, poi quello della Repubblica Veneta, poi quello del governo unitario, cioè sono 200 anni e passa di vita. È un'accademia un po' particolare la nostra rispetto a quelle altre del nostro paese, perché è un'accademia che si trova in una posizione, fortunatamente devo dire, assolutamente autonoma. È un'accademia che si sostiene da sola, non ha bisogno di supporti decisivi esterni, ha bisogno di molte collaborazioni che sempre cerca e molto spesso trova, di carattere sempre molto qualificato, e sono cose di cui siamo molto grati. Però abbiamo una situazione che ci consente di fare quello che vogliamo, una situazione di assoluta libertà, e questa libertà ci consente anche di fare queste iniziative quando vogliamo, con chi vogliamo, sperando che possano andare nel migliore dei modi. In questo caso ci muoviamo in uno dei settori che l'Istituto Veneto di Scienze, Lettere ed Arti coltiva. Il nome stesso lo dice. La storia è un aspetto, soltanto un aspetto delle nostre iniziative. La storia è inevitabilmente anche storia di Venezia. Da questo punto di vista la storia di Venezia e l'incontro di oggi è abbastanza in continuità con un altro incontro piuttosto recente di cui sono usciti gli atti da non molti giorni, da qualche settimana, gli atti del convegno sul Commonwealth, e qui mi fa piacere rivedere alcuni degli amici che avevano collaborato a quella occasione, a quella iniziativa, che spero siano rimasti soddisfatti di come gli atti sono stati raccolti, il volume sul Commonwealth veneziano. Questo convegno è un po' su quella linea. Venezia tra Medioevo, età moderna. È un convegno che ha una gestazione un po' lunga. Mi permetterei di ricordare qual è l'origine lontana di questo incontro. L'origine lontana è molto casuale, parte sì, veramente dal caso di un giovane bizantinista che ormai non pochi anni fa era a Parigi, legato a voi, legato al CNRS, con rapporti formali che gli consentivano di lavorare a Parigi, e gli si disse: guarda, intanto che sei lì, dai un'occhiata a quel codice che è alla nazionale, vedi cosa c'è. E lui prese questo codice e per quella via ci si incamminò su una tipologia documentaria veneziana totalmente sconosciuta. Quello delle tariffe. Sopra casa è presente qui, eccolo lì, fra l'altro molto alto, si vede bene, l'ho rivisto subito. E vi dicevo, è iniziato un lavoro di 10 anni di studi, partendo da quel suggerimento del tutto occasionale a un bizantinista che faceva altre cose. e su quella linea poi è venuto in luce un gruppo di documenti di questo genere, un gruppo di tariffe che sono appunto una tipologia pochissimo nota in precedenza, mai edita. Qualcosa c'era stato soprattutto in anni passati, ormai lontani, da parte di un nostro consocio, di Ugo Tucci, che si era occupato di tariffe. Quello che è uscito è una specie di, sono 3 kg di pagine con testo, indici e cose d'altro genere. 10 anni di lavoro, tipologia di fonti. È sembrato opportuno riprendere questo tema che poi lo stesso Sopracasa ha proseguito con volume che i relatori credo abbiano già visto, vedranno, su Costantinopoli e il Levante, negli atti di un notaio veneziano. La proiezione è larga del nostro incontro, la proiezione è larga perché è largo il tipo di documento dal quale siamo partiti. E toccava la Siria, toccava il Nord Europa, toccava l'Africa del Nord, questo tipo di documento. È un documento anche un tipo di documento che ci ha suggerito un incontro in cui puntare insieme su 2 livelli, su 2 piani. Da un lato la documentazione, la tipologia documentaria, il documento in sé, il tipo di documento. Dall'altro lato la presenza veneziana nello scacchiere internazionale. Uno scacchiere internazionale che nel nostro convegno, partendo appunto da questi lavori, è rivolto soprattutto verso Oriente, verso il Mediterraneo e verso l'Oriente anche più in profondità. Ora, questo è un passaggio di cui io mi auguro che i risultati saranno positivi, è un passaggio che deve alcuni ringraziamenti. E il primo ringraziamento è il CNRS, al professor Chenet in particolare, che è stato quello che ha collaborato, sostenuto inizialmente queste presenze in Francia, queste ricerche in Francia, ma anche al professor Empereur, il CNRS di Alessandria d'Egitto, che è stato decisivo nella collaborazione per la pubblicazione di questi, vi dicevo, non dire volume, un po' poco, di questi 3 kg di pagine piene, fitte e dense. Ancora qualcosa poi porterà qui ringraziamenti, ma intanto ci sono i nostri, a Mosconas, al collega Mosconas, per la collaborazione che ha in qualche modo dato all'organizzazione di questo convegno con il suo centro di studi sulle isole Ionie. Io a questo punto ho finito la mia parte. Chiederei però al collega Chenet di dire qualcosa, se ne ha voglia. Mi auguro di sì, a proposito di questo incontro, di quello che crederà, ma soprattutto gli chiederei di fermarsi qui con noi per coordinare i lavori di questo pomeriggio. I lavori di questo pomeriggio che vedono una specie di, non una specie, una parte introduttiva che è la lezione che ci terrà David Jacobi e successivamente 2 relazioni, i 2 interventi che sono previsti, che sono quelli degli amici Hoquet e Falchetta. Io a questo punto finito darei subito la parola a lei. Prego.
Merci. Je suis probablement le seul non-italophone de cette salle et comme dans le programme il est autorisé de parler en français, je profiterai de cette licence. Alors l'époque qui fait l'objet de cette rencontre ne m'est évidemment pas très familière, puisque je suis un spécialiste des Macédoniens et des Comnènes. Cependant, je vais vous offrir quelques réflexions qui sont donc plus celles d'un lecteur, évidemment, que d'un chercheur pour l'époque des paléologues. L'histoire des relations entre Venise et l'Empire byzantin a donné lieu à une abondante littérature qui, elle aussi, a connu une évolution, notamment sur les deux événements marquants, le traité passé par Alexis Comnène en 1082 et la prise de Constantinople en 1204, qui a d'ailleurs cessé de paraître inéluctablement lié à 1082. En 1082, quand on regarde, on voit qu'Alexis Comnène a choisi de reprendre un précédent glorieux, celui de Basile II, faire appel à une flotte sans la payer, en lui accordant à ceux qui fournissaient la flotte des avantages. Les conséquences économiques des concessions accordées à cette date n'avaient sûrement pas été mesurées en 1082, car elles étaient probablement assez modestes compte tenu du volume des échanges internationaux à cette époque. Le mécontentement des marchands de Constantinople, provoqué par la rupture des règles de concurrence, n'avait pas non plus été mesuré, soit par dédain impérial à l'égard des marchands, soit plus vraisemblablement par myopie des dirigeants. Vénitiens et Byzantins ont connu des moments de tension, mais ils ne doivent pas être surestimés, puisque en 1198 encore, un accord est conclu entre l'empereur Alexis III Ange et les Vénitiens. Les travaux de Madden et Gweller et autres historiens américains me paraissent avoir montré de façon convaincante que la conquête de Constantinople n'était pas dans les projets des croisés lorsqu'ils ont conçu ce que nous appelons la 4e croisade. Il n'en demeure pas moins que 1204 marque un changement, dans la mesure où les Vénitiens, qui avaient fourni un apport décisif avec leur flotte et qui furent les grands bénéficiaires de la croisade, constat que firent également les Byzantins, qui regardèrent désormais avec méfiance les entreprises de la Sérénissime. Mais il se trouve que l'alliance alternative avec Gênes leur a aussi apporté des déboires, comme l'installation de cette colonie face à Constantinople, dotée de murailles contre la volonté du basileus. L'histoire traditionnelle de la Byzance des paléologues recherchait des symptômes de décomposition interne et d'inéluctable décadence qui devait s'achever évidemment par la prise de Constantinople. C'est vrai que durant l'époque des paléologues, l'Empire a pris plusieurs formes. C'est encore un État impérial sous Michel VIII, paléologue, assis à la fois sur l'Asie et l'Europe. C'est encore un puissant État balkanique possible sous Andronique III, mais après la guerre civile, après la peste et la montée en puissance des Ottomans, Constantinople se réduit, je ne dirais pas tout à fait à la taille d'une cité-État, puisqu'il reste quelques territoires comme la Morée et les principaux rivages de la Marmara et d'une partie de la mer Noire. Tous les savants ont souligné la fragilité de ce dernier avatar de l'Empire romain d'Orient. Donc, premier thème classique, la décomposition de l'Empire. Le second thème est sur l'économie du monde byzantin qui aurait été totalement sous la coupe des villes italiennes, monopolisant le commerce en mer Noire et privant l'Empire de ressources précieuses. Et ce manque de ressources aurait évidemment accentué la décadence de l'Empire. Enfin, une idée encore toujours très répandue, on la trouve sous la plume d'Anthony Breyer, dans l'excellent ouvrage The Byzantine Empire, édité par Jonathan Shepard. Donc, idée répandue, les Byzantins, au moment ultime de leur destinée, auraient manifesté une présence pour le turban turc plutôt que pour la coiffe latine, selon le fameux mot de Lucan Taras en 1453. Je crois que sur ces 3 points, les travaux de ces dernières décennies ont largement modifié les perspectives. Sur l'impuissance impériale, une thèse française de Raoul Estangui montre que le titre impérial donnait encore à son titulaire un prestige durable auprès des populations balkaniques, et d'autre part que le basileus a jusqu'en 1453 gardé la capacité de lever l'impôt et de se faire respecter par l'aristocratie qui constituait toujours l'armature sociale de Byzance. La gravité de la situation, si elle n'a pas mis fin aux querelles familiales, n'a plus engagé de sécession territoriale. Les empereurs, en effet, durant le dernier siècle, se sont constamment préoccupés de la sécurité des habitants des possessions impériales, ordonnant de nombreuses constructions de fortifications pour retarder l'avance turque. Ils ont même réussi à accroître la pression fiscale et à abolir les privilèges mieux que des empereurs antérieurs. Ils établirent même des taxes sur le commerce occidental, mais évidemment dont le revenu dépendait de la paix en Méditerranée qui fut loin d'être assurée. De plus, ils étaient des intermédiaires naturels tant qu'ils tenaient une grande partie des ports côtiers entre l'arrière-pays ottoman agricole et les Italiens. Sans aucun doute, les Ottomans ont été impossibles à arrêter, mais il faut le noter que même pour les puissantes armées occidentales, que ce soit à Nicopolis ou à Varna, le résultat fut le même. Mais les empereurs ne sont jamais restés passifs face à eux. Du point de vue économique, les nouveaux documents publiés depuis plus d'un demi-siècle, tout particulièrement évidemment ceux tirés des riches archives des villes italiennes, ont révélé que les Byzantins n'étaient pas relégués seulement au modeste cabotage le long des côtes de la mer Égée ou contraints de fournir des équipages aux marchands italiens. Le livre de comptes de Badoer, pourtant rédigé en 1436, quelques années avant la chute de Constantinople, montre que le Vénitien entretenait des relations d'affaires avec tout un réseau de commerçants et de banquiers grecs. Thierry Ganchou, présent dans cette salle, avec d'autres comme Matschke, a pu, grâce aux archives italiennes et donc tout particulièrement vénitiennes, retrouver les éléments de la fortune des hommes d'affaires liés à l'Italie, tels que les Notaras, les Goudelais, qui étaient extrêmement riches et avaient placé leurs fonds en sécurité dans les banques de Venise et de Gênes. Peu avant leur prise par les Ottomans, Thessalonique et Constantinople, qui comptaient chacune plusieurs dizaines de milliers d'habitants, restaient des centres commerciaux très actifs. Déjà pour une époque antérieure, Angeliki Laiu et mon voisin David Jacobi avaient corrigé l'image du marchand byzantin passif et ont trouvé trace de présence de ces marchands jusqu'en Égypte, même à l'époque des Comnènes. Je crois que l'image du marchand byzantin a été défavorisée évidemment par le déséquilibre des sources, les archives byzantines ayant été presque toutes perdues, à l'exception de celle du Mont Athos, qui renseigne évidemment plus sur la vie rurale que sur les activités commerciales. Il est certain que les marchands italiens, notamment vénitiens, se sentaient solidaires de l'aristocratie byzantine sous son dernier avatar, celui d'homme d'affaires, et certains venaient même s'établir à Constantinople et y contracter mariage. Sur le troisième et dernier point, la détestation des Latins au point de préférer les Turcs, il faut sans doute également réviser nos points de vue. Sans aucun doute, des notables grecs ont coopéré avec les Turcs avant et après 1453. Cette collaboration ne donne pas d'informations sur l'état d'esprit de ces personnages, sauf sur le fait qu'ils jouent la carte de la victoire ottomane de façon assez réaliste, puisque les Ottomans étaient leurs maîtres et étaient en mesure de leur maintenir un statut social élevé. C'est ainsi qu'une partie de l'aristocratie byzantine dans les provinces qui ont été conquises par les Ottomans ont cherché à conserver leur domaine, d'autant qu'au XVe siècle, les Ottomans devaient tenir les Balkans avec peu de monde. La religion ne tient aucun rôle dans cette attitude, fruit d'un commun intérêt au maintien des structures antérieures. Certes, la fracture religieuse ne peut être minimisée, et la majeure partie des Grecs, même dans l'entourage de l'empereur, étaient hostiles à l'Église romaine. Les extrémistes ont partagé sans doute l'idée que l'âme étant plus importante que le corps, et donc entre deux mots, le turc n'était pas le pire. Mais d'abord, les tensions religieuses n'étaient pas permanentes et n'interdisaient pas, par exemple, d'excellentes relations commerciales. Et un Luca Notaras pouvait tout à la fois exprimer son hostilité à Rome tout en mettant sa fortune en sécurité en Italie, étant citoyen des villes de Gênes et de Venise. Mais je crois que la preuve formelle de la solidarité entre Grecs et Latins me semble apportée par les circonstances du dernier siège de 1453. Alors que les défenseurs manifestement se trouvaient en position très critique, 2000 Latins, génois comme vénitiens, vinrent soutenir les 5000 défenseurs grecs. Je crois qu'il n'y a pas eu de défection notable durant le siège, alors que la situation de la ville était de plus en plus désespérée, et donc partant, pas d'attirance pour une domination ottomane. Et il faut dire que les Latins ont payé un lourd tribut lors de la prise de la ville. Plusieurs centaines de Vénitiens et de Crétois auraient péri. Le bail vénitien a été exécuté. Et il faut noter que les aristocrates grecs qui ont pu s'enfuir se sont tous dirigés vers les territoires latins ou les provinces byzantines encore libres. Alors d'où vient cette idée, au moins en partie, de la séparation forte des deux parties de la chrétienté? Je crois qu'elle vient sans doute de l'Église orthodoxe postérieure à 1453. Elle ne pouvait survivre qu'en collaborant avec Mehmed II et donc en l'assurant que les Latins étaient les ennemis de l'Église comme les siens et qu'elle ne soutiendrait pas une nouvelle croisade occidentale dont la menace persistait encore. En conséquence, pour cette Église, les faits qui montraient à quel point les Grecs détestaient les Latins devaient être soulignés pour assurer le meilleur statut possible aux nouveaux Millettes dans l'Empire ottoman. 1453 marque bien une rupture majeure de l'histoire des peuples balkaniques. Sans doute, les réseaux commerciaux ont été moins touchés, Venise conservant encore de nombreuses positions et le sultan ayant aussi besoin d'entretenir des relations commerciales avec l'Occident latin. Et donc, je crois que l'intérêt de cette conférence sera de mettre en valeur cette unité économique de l'espace méditerranéen avant et après 1453, quels que soient les aléas politiques. Je vous remercie.
Molte grazie per questa apertura di premessa proprio rispetto ai temi che andiamo ad affrontare. E ora darei la parola a David Jacobi.
The investigation of commercial and colonial expansion in the Eastern Mediterranean in the later Middle Ages has been dominated so far by a Eurocentric and bipolar approach. The emphasis has been upon the expansion of the Western maritime powers and long-range trade and shipping. Moreover, Western expansion has been examined separately with regard to each of the regions bordering the Eastern Mediterranean, namely Byzantium, the Frankish states in the Levant, or the political entities of the Islamic East. Grossly speaking, the Christian West is viewed as a dominant and dynamic partner in a colonial type of commercial exchange, exploiting the resources of rather passive and underdeveloped Eastern Mediterranean regions, which merely reacted to Western stimulus and had an essentially limited function. They produced some foodstuffs, raw materials, and industrial commodities, and mainly served as intermediaries between the West and the regions of Asia, providing costly Oriental commodities. This biased Eurocentric approach has been furthered by a sharp imbalance between Western, mainly Italian sources reflecting trade, increasingly abundant from the 13th century onward, and the relevant Eastern Mediterranean documentation, which is rather meager. A shift in focus and a more balanced perspective are required. It is essential to begin in the early 11th century, when the first stage of commercial growth in the Eastern Mediterranean began. It is during this phase, which extended to the mid-13th century, that the economic and institutional parameters of later medieval developments were established. After a period of economic contraction lasting several centuries, a conjunction of economic and social factors launched a process of economic growth noticeable from the early 11th century onward in Byzantium, the Islamic Middle East, and the Christian West, especially in Italy. Demographic increase, urbanization, and economic growth were then common in all these regions. The accumulation of wealth generated growing and increasingly diversified demand beyond princely courts and a small affluent social elite. In turn, this broader demand stimulated market-oriented production of surpluses. The change in both consumption and production patterns first generated an intensification of trade within each of the Mediterranean regions. This trade was partly carried out with the support of cabotage, the transport of passengers and cargoes between ports located at fairly short or medium range distances one from another, and with tramping calling into ports without a fixed schedule. These shipping patterns, practiced over short and medium distances, are generally neglected in research despite their importance because of the existing focus upon long-range navigation. Although coastal sailing was the rule, strong commercial incentives also prompted shipmasters and merchants to engage in open sea navigation to convey goods over long distances. These developments are illustrated in various ways. Small and medium-sized ships with a carrying capacity of at most 30 to 40 metric tons conveyed agricultural and pastoral produce, such as olive oil and cheese, from the Byzantine provinces in the Aegean to Constantinople. Wine produced by the monastery of Ganos on the northern shore of the Marmara Sea also reached Constantinople, various destinations in the Mediterranean and the Crimea, as revealed by amphoras found with shipwrecks. Exceptionally, though, a large vessel with a carrying capacity of 220 metric tons was involved in the shipping of that wine. 11th century internal demand in Byzantium also stimulated local landlords in Thebes and some Aegean islands to invest in the establishment and financing of silk workshops, the studies being exported to various cities in the Byzantine Empire, as well as to southern Italy, Venice, and Genoa. A Byzantine ship engaged in tramping that sank around 1025 along the southwestern coast of Asia Minor illustrates medium-range inter-regional trade. The ship was returning from the southern Syrian-Lebanese coast with raisins, Syrian glassware, and 3 tons of glass waste to be recycled, possibly also with Syrian plant ashes, yet another ingredient entering in glass making. The conquest of Egypt by the Fatimids in 969 and the transfer of their power center from Tunisia to Fustat or Old Cairo was followed by the steady economic decline of Tunisia, evident by the mid-11th century, and in contrast, a surge in the Egyptian economy. Fustat became the commercial and financial center of Egypt. The growth of flax and the manufacture of linen expanded in response to domestic and foreign demand. Both commodities were exported on an ever larger scale to Tunisia and Sicily. So far, I have pointed to demand and production within the Eastern Mediterranean region itself as a factor propelling trade. Yet there was also a conjunction of political and economic factors contributing to that process. Most of the Oriental food condiments, dyestuffs, and aromatics, collectively called spices in the Middle Ages, arrived from southern and eastern Asia. Political instability in the Persian Gulf in the late 10th century increasingly diverted the channeling of spices through that region to the Red Sea and the Nile Valley. As a result, the Byzantine port of Trebizond in northeastern Asia Minor lost its function as major spice market, and by the first half of the 11th century, Alexandria, with the support of its Fatimid rulers, established itself as the main Mediterranean source of these oriental commodities. Alexandria maintained this function until the 16th century. The reorientation of the spice trade had a profound impact upon the Black Sea and the Mediterranean maritime networks. It limited the range, volume, and value of goods exported from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean via Constantinople. Byzantium at the west became dependent upon Egypt for the supply of spices for several centuries. As a result, trade between Byzantium and Egypt intensified. Byzantine purchases of spices in Egypt, some massive, are documented from 1035 onwards. They were mainly financed by silk textiles, agriculture and pastoral produce, and mastic from the island of Chios, presumably also by timber and iron from Asia Minor. It is commonly believed that Western growing demand for Oriental spices was the main stimulus for Italian trading in Egypt from the 11th century onwards. An additional commodity also made an important contribution in that respect. The expanding woolen industry in the Low Countries and cotton manufacture in northern Italy required alum for the fixing of colorants on textile fibers. Alum was also used to a lesser extent in the preparation of skins and leather and in medicine. Egypt produced substantial quantities of the mineral. By the middle of the 11th century, the Egyptian authorities had perceived the importance of alum for Western merchants and turned its sale into a state monopoly. Moreover, until the early 13th century, they covered with alum 2/3 of their purchases from Western merchants. The West remained largely dependent upon Egyptian alum until the second half of the 13th century, when the mineral from Asia Minor increasingly replaced it. The Western purchase of spices and alum in Egypt was mainly financed by the delivery of Western timber and iron, eagerly awaited by the Fatimid authorities because indispensable for the maintenance of their naval power and the strengthening of their army. Yet Western merchants also paid in gold because of their negative balance of trade. By the 11th century, Italian purchases in Byzantium were no more limited to luxury products such as silk textiles. They also included Syrian cotton for the northern Italian weavers. However, Venetian and Amalfitan merchants could not offer in exchange commodities or precious metals of equal value. In order to bridge that imbalance, they financed much of their purchases in the empire by integrating within the growing maritime supply network. They practiced cabotage and tramping along the Byzantine shores, and in the course of their journeys reinvested the proceeds from trading and transportation services. The intensification of commercial exchange between Byzantium and Fatimid territories in the 11th century induced Venetians and Amalfitans to extend the geographic range of these practices to the Levantine shore as far as Egypt. They were involved in the shipping of agriculture and pastoral produce from the Byzantine provinces to Constantinople, as well as to Alexandria and Italy. By the late 11th century, they had already established a triangular pattern of maritime trade connecting their home base with both these cities. This triangular pattern was consolidated following the establishment of the Crusader states in the Levant somewhat later and the involvement of Pisan and Genoese merchants in this process. Italian mercantile activity increasingly replaced Byzantine and Muslim trading and especially shipping along the waterway linking the empire to Egypt. In the second half of the 12th century, Venice, Genoa, and Pisa achieved a dominant position in that framework, partly thanks to the large shipping tonnage. Amalfi could not compete in that respect with these powers, and its trade in the eastern Mediterranean began to decline. Venetian and Genoese domination in maritime trade between Byzantium and Egypt persisted until the 15th century. Two further 11th century developments deserve our attention since they also had a long-lasting impact on Eastern Mediterranean trade, namely Western settlement and the establishment of Western commercial outposts. Beginning in the 11th century, some Italian merchants settled in Byzantium, whether for a number of years or permanently. Political and military circumstances enabled Venice to consolidate the trading and presence of its merchants in the empire. In 1082, it obtained tax exemptions as well as a territorial base in the form of a quarter or trading outpost in Constantinople. This treaty was a turning point in bilateral relations between territorial states in the Eastern Mediterranean and Western maritime powers. It served as a precedent for all Western powers seeking privileges, whether in Byzantium, the Crusader states, or from the mid-12th century in Egypt. However, the extent of the privileges they obtained differed. Some Western outposts developed into ex-territorial enclaves. On the other hand, in Egypt, the fondoks or caravanserai granted to the Western maritime nations remained property of the Sultan, although governed by these nations from the 13th century onwards. This arrangement persisted for several centuries. It should be stressed that whatever the extent of the privileges, the existence of Western outposts on foreign soil remained precarious, since they could be abolished by the ruler of the land, which indeed happened at several occasions. The long-term economic impact of the Crusades on Mediterranean trade has been hotly debated. Some consider that the Crusades, or rather the existence of the Crusader states, stimulated trade, while others contend that the developments they generated would have anyhow occurred. Adopting the middle ground appears to be the most plausible approach. Upon arrival in the Levant, Western merchants, crusaders, and pilgrims encountered new commodities produced in the Crusader states or imported from Muslim-ruled territories. For instance, the participants in the First Crusade met for the first time sugarcane, which they called canamel, honeycane, because honey was the only sweetener to which they were accustomed. Venetians got acquainted with the use of plant ashes and sand with a high silica content in Levantine glassworks and transferred Levantine glass-making technology to Venice. Especially massive pilgrimage to the Holy Land contributed to the large dissemination of numerous Eastern commodities by those returning to the West. In turn, growing Western demand stimulated investments of capital and labor in existing branches of the economy in the Crusader states. This is illustrated by the export-oriented cultivation of cash crops such as sugar and cotton, and the production of silk supplied to silk weavers in Lucca and Venice. The manufacture of glassware, camlets, and silk textiles in the Crusader states also responded to Western demand. On the other hand, the large population of Western settlers and their descendants in the Crusader states, which basically maintained Western modes of living, stimulated imports of Western commodities. Imports of foodstuffs markedly increased following the massive loss of land to the Muslims in 1187. In addition, the virtual state of war with neighboring Islamic states required the purchase of weapons, timber, and iron. In sum, for around 2 centuries, the existence of the Crusader states contributed to accelerate the growth of trans-Mediterranean trade, both by their own production and by their imports, yet shipping routes remained unchanged. The Fourth Crusade ended in 1204 with the Latin conquest of Constantinople and resulted in the territorial disintegration of the Byzantine Empire. It was followed by some important developments that impacted on trade. Following the events of 1204, Constantinople lost its major role as consumption center. Moreover, it suffered from the absence of capital inflow in cash and goods from the provinces, the lack of investments in high-grade manufacture, and the demise of its luxury production. As a result, the transit and transshipment of goods in the framework of medium and long-distance trade and transportation between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea acquired growing importance and became the basic factor sustaining the operation of the city's economy until the late 15th century. The first half of the 13th century witnessed growing Western demand of foodstuffs such as grain, cheese, wine, mastic, and salt, industrial raw materials such as alum, cotton, and silk, as well as silk textiles. The flow of surpluses from the Aegean region directed towards Constantinople before 1204 was now increasingly toward Western markets. The conjunction of economic contraction in Constantinople and growing Western demand resulted in a partial reorientation of commercial and maritime networks in the Eastern Mediterranean. The political and territorial fragmentation of the Byzantine Empire and the creation of a fairly large number of Latin political entities in the Aegean region promoted Latin immigration and settlement in these territories on a scale and along patterns unknown before the First Crusade. Nuclei of Western settlers were established in numerous ports and were reinforced over time, especially in Venetian-ruled territories. Indeed, following the Fourth Crusade, Venice extended its rule over Crete and the cities of Modona and Corona in the southern and western Peloponnese, the foundation of its colonial empire. The status of these colonies under exclusive Venetian control differed from that of outposts on foreign soil obtained by Venice, for instance at Negroponte in the island of Euboea. The rivalry between Venice and Genoa in long-distance trade and shipping resulted in the fragmentation of the Aegean region along political lines. Each of the two maritime powers consolidated its dominance over specific waterways and maritime spaces, Venice in the western and Genoa in the eastern Aegean, a process completed by the mid-14th century. Candia, the capital of Venetian Crete, became the major transit and transshipment station between Venice on the one hand, Cyprus, Egypt, Syria, and the Turkish Emirates of southern and western Asia Minor on the other. Negroponte fulfilled the same function with respect to the western Aegean, Constantinople, and the Black Sea. It precipitated the 14th century economic decline of Byzantine Thessalonica as market and port of call in long-distance trade. Modona, the major outlet for commodities of the southern Peloponnese, assumed a major role as transit and transshipment station thanks to its location at the juncture of the two main Venetian shipping lanes in the eastern Mediterranean, one leading to Constantinople and the other to Egypt. The consolidation of Venetian dominance over the western Aegean was partly furthered by the Genoese focus on the island of Chios and on commercial expansion in the Black Sea. The events of 1204 also impacted on the Black Sea trade. The Mediterranean and the Black Sea formed distinct commercial regions until around the mid-13th century. Each of these regions largely handled different goods within its own trading patterns and shipping networks. Sailing from one region to the other was rather exceptional, since Constantinople, located at their juncture, absorbed most of the trading goods reaching the city until 1204. Still, some vessels carrying Mediterranean wine or olive oil crossed the Dardanelles. Following the Fourth Crusade, Venetians began to trade in Black Sea grain. Alum from Colonera in northeastern Asia Minor, the best brand of that mineral, was also exported to the west. The transport of these two commodities appears to have promoted direct sailings from the Black Sea to Italy without transshipment in Constantinople. The extension of Mongol rule over vast territories in Asia and Eastern Europe, which reached the Black Sea by 1240, furthered that process. It led to the full integration of the commercial networks of the Mediterranean and the Black Sea in the second half of the 13th century. This integration was to last for about 2 centuries until after the fall of Crossroads, and Trebizond served as its maritime outlet. The flow of goods north of the Caspian Sea passed through Urgench in Uzbekistan, Sarai on the Volga River, capital of the Golden Horde, to reach Tana at the mouth of the Don River, and Soldaya and Kaffa in the Crimea. Trade in the Black Sea and Mongol territories in Asia and Eastern Europe from the 13th century onward is commonly considered as a mere extension of Mediterranean trade. This biased Eurocentric approach must be rejected. To be sure, secure conditions stimulated a much larger flow of goods and enabled the trading of Western merchants in Mongol territories. A convergence of interest linked Western merchants to Mongol rulers who were eager to purchase specific Western goods and to increase their own commercial profits and fiscal revenue. Yet undue importance has been ascribed to the penetration of Western merchants in Mongol territories. Those traveling from the Black Sea to China, as described around 1340 by the Florentine Francesco Balducci Pergolotti, were clearly a minority. Trans-Asian trade was overwhelmingly conducted by Asian merchants and middlemen and was run in a series of closely interlocked and partly overlapping regional networks, not directly between the Black Sea and China. Moreover, the Mongol territories offered a large range of commodities in demand in the West, such as grain, box, hides and furs, industrial raw materials such as cotton and silk, as well as silk, textiles and slaves. From the 1280s, Oriental spices were also available in Black Sea ports. Western merchants brought foodstuffs and wine from Mediterranean regions extending as far as the Iberian Peninsula. The sale of Italian silk textiles and woolens from England, Flanders, Catalonia and Italy, especially from Venice and Florence, trade remained negative. The integration of the Mediterranean, Black Sea and Mongol trading networks was a major factor in the emergence of a globalized economy which opened a new phase in commercial expansion. The main features of this important macroeconomic development were a marked increase in the range, volume and value of exchange goods, trading over long distances, the intensification and acceleration of trade, and a greater economic connectivity and interdependence between remote regions. Contrary to the common perception, the operation of the globalized economic network was maintained after the collapse of the so-called Pax Mongolica in the 1340s, and in its framework, Western merchants continued to trade in Mongol territories, though in a more limited geographic range and volume than earlier. However, the presence of Western merchants and commercial agents settling in Constantinople and around the Black Sea, or operating there over several years, was far more important in the long run. The fall of the Frankish states in the Levant to Mamluk Egypt in 1291 and the papal embargo on trade with Mamluk Egypt in Syria produced within a short period a restructuring in the regional and the long-distance maritime networks. The impact of the papal embargo on trade has been vastly overrated, since it was only moderately effective. To be sure, it hampered to some extent direct between the West and Mamluk territories, yet Greeks and Arabic-speaking Oriental Christians living in Cyprus were not bound by the papal embargo and acted as middlemen. Genoa, Venice, and the kings of Aragon maintained their agreements with Egypt after 1291 or concluded new ones furthering their trade. The embargo was also circumvented by many Western merchants. Despite its more stringent enforcement from 1324 to 1340, Western traffic with Mamluk territories continued, whether directly or indirectly through middlemen. The developments of 1291 boosted the function of Cypriot Famagusta, which replaced Acre as transit and transshipment station between the West, Layatzo, the major port of Cilician Armenia, and Mamluk territories, as well as between Constantinople and Alexandria. The papal embargo also enhanced the role of Layatzo as Mediterranean outlet of trans-Mediterranean trade and a shipping station for Syrian commodities and Oriental spices, although Alexandria maintained its dominant function in that respect. The fall of Acre enabled the rise of Beirut, which had suffered only limited damage in 1291. At first, Beirut served as maritime outlet of Syrian cotton. Yet by the 1320s, it exported to the West an impressive number and variety of commodities arriving from Damascus, which included those imported from Baghdad and Tabriz. Beirut also benefited from a shift in the itinerary of spices coming from India, which occurred in the mid-14th century because of political turmoil in the Arabian Peninsula. Instead of crossing the Red Sea from Aden to Aydab on the African coast and traveling along the Nile, the spices were conveyed to Mecca, which acted as distribution center. Some of the spices were sent to Alexandria and others to Damascus, from where they reached Beirut and Tripoli. The Mamluk occupation of Layazzo in 1337 further stimulated Beirut's economy, and the city became one of the major emporia of the Eastern Mediterranean. Famagusta's role in long-distance maritime commerce declined following the relaxation of the papal embargo in 1344. The full resumption of direct Western trade and shipping with Egypt and Syria in the following year deflected much traffic from Cyprus and reduced the island's role as intermediary. It nevertheless retained some of its functions as stopover, warehouse, and transshipment station, thanks to its proximity to Egypt and Syria and the large-scale exports of its sugar and cotton. Capital investments boosted sugar production and quality, and thanks to technological innovations, Cypriot sugar became cheaper than the Levantine browns, which enabled its intrusion into Mamluk Egypt and Syria from the late 14th century onwards. Its export to the West continued despite strong competition from rapidly expanding production in the kingdoms of Sicily and Granada. Some Venetian state galleys were sent to Cyprus for the exclusive transport of sugar, and in 1366 Venice established a similar shipping line for cotton from Cyprus, Syria, and Egypt. The Genoese occupation of Famagusta from 1374 to 1464 had a long-lasting impact on the economy and maritime trade of Cyprus. From 1380s, Venetian as well as other Western non-Genoese merchants and ships largely bypassed Cyprus on their way from the west or Constantinople to Egypt and Syria. Within the regional framework of the Eastern Mediterranean, these developments generated a shift in maritime trade maintained throughout most of the 15th century in favor of Crete and Rhodes. By the 1430s, Venice had gained the upper hand over Genoa and its other rivals in the Levant trade. The use of the Venetian ducato as the main currency of international business transactions, including by the Genoese, was but one aspect of the Venetian ascendancy in the region. The Ottoman conquests from the 1320s in Asia Minor and from the 1350s in the Balkans stimulated the developments of Bursa and Edirne, the successive Ottoman capitals. Both cities became major trading and consumption centers by the second half of the 14th century. Apparently around 1400, the Ottomans established a new Silk Road across Asia Minor. Instead of traveling from Tabriz to Trebizond, Iranian caravans bringing silk from the Caspian region proceeded via Erzincan and Ankara to Bursa. This development was furthered by the destruction of Tana by Timur in 1395. The Ottoman conquest of Constantinople in 1453 was followed by a rapid and spectacular growth of the city's population, largely achieved by the forceful transfer of inhabitants from the provinces in the following decades. This policy required the secure provisioning of the city in foodstuffs and raw materials. The Black Sea surpluses were now mainly directed toward Istanbul and absorbed by the city. Italian merchants were still allowed to operate in the Black Sea even after the Ottoman occupation of all the region's Genoese outposts in 1475, yet all goods had to be transshipped in Istanbul. As a result, the Black Sea reverted to the role it had fulfilled before the Fourth Crusade, an economic region distinct from the Mediterranean. The globalized trade network passing through Constantinople, established in the second half of the 13th century, ceased to function even before the Ottoman closure of the Black Sea to foreign vessels in the 17th century. From the 1460s, Venetian policies regarding Cyprus were largely determined by its rivalry with the Ottomans. The transformation of the island due to a Venetian protectorate occurred in the midst of the Venetian-Ottoman War, which lasted from 1463 to 1479. Strategic and naval consideration, tightly interwoven with economic interest, induced Venice to annex Cyprus in 1489. The move was prompted by Venice's efforts to ensure the defense of all its overseas possessions and to establish a broad coalition against the Ottomans. This was the large major addition to Venice's colonial empire. It did not alter trading or shipping patterns, nor did the Portuguese discovery of the direct trading route to the Indian Ocean in the late 15th century. The bulk of pepper imports continued to reach Alexandria until the mid-16th century. Ship tonnage and the economic impact of outposts and colonies call for some short remarks. It has been claimed that the transportation of crusaders, their horses and equipment from the mid-12th century onward decisively contributed to an increase in ship tonnage. Rather, commercial considerations were the main incentive in that respect. The transportation of timber to Egypt and alum on the return way, both bulky commodities, was more profitable if undertaken in large quantities. Clearly, a substantial increase in tonnage occurred before the mid-12th century. Further increases in tonnage were not only related to larger volumes of trade, but also to other cost-cutting measures. Rationalizing long-range transportation was achieved by the concentration of goods with the help of cabotage. Cheaper transportation of bulky cargoes of alum and grain also required large ships. It is likely that massive pilgrimage to the Holy Land acted in the same way. By 1233, the Hospitallers and the Templars carried no less than 1,500 pilgrims on some of their ships. The Venetian Maritime Statutes of 1229 referred to vessels of 470 tons, and a Genoese ship of 600 tons is attested in 1251, yet these were rather exceptionally large until the late 13th century, when the number of large ships began to increase, and some reached 1,100 tons in the 14th century. The trading of settlers in commercial outposts and colonies is generally considered an integral part of the economic activity of the cities from which they emigrated. According to the commonly assumed colonial paradigm of commercial exchanges between the West and the Eastern Mediterranean, the settlers transferred their profits to their respective city of origin. The sources suggest that such capital outflow did not occur. To be sure, Western expatriates maintained contact with members of their families and often conducted joint business ventures with them. However, they invested most or all of their gains in the city of region in which they resided, whether in economic ventures, construction, consumption, services, or in the bolstering of their social standing. There are numerous examples in this respect in the Frankish Levant, Venetian Crete, and other regions. The dynamic response of local landlords, entrepreneurs, manufacturers, merchants, middlemen, and providers of other services in the Eastern Mediterranean regions to domestic as well as foreign demand disproves the notion that these regions were passive and underdeveloped partners in trans-Mediterranean commercial exchange. The negative balance of trade of the West in its trade with the Eastern Mediterranean and the Black Sea was maintained despite growing exports of woolen and silk textiles. While considering trans-Mediterranean trade, especially Italian trade, as a dynamic factor in the Mediterranean economy, due attention should be paid to demand and supply in all the regions of the Eastern Mediterranean and the Black Sea as the driving forces in the growth and geographic expansion of trade and shipping. The contribution of the rural, industrial, and service sectors of all borderlands to that economy was essential. As noted, the common segmentation of the Eastern Mediterranean and the treatment of each of its regions as a separate economic entity largely concealed the interdependence and evolving relations between these regions. Their respective productive capacity and their contribution as intermediaries in the Mediterranean economy. In that framework, for instance, the existence of a north-south trade axis between Byzantium and Egypt and of inter-regional trade along the southern shore of the Mediterranean is important. Moreover, the economies of the Eastern Mediterranean were not exclusively geared toward the sea, but rather simultaneously integrated with their trading networks on the Asian and African continents and in the seas along their shores. It is along these lines that commercial and colonial expansion in the Eastern Mediterranean in the late Middle Ages should be investigated with due attention to macroeconomic developments. Thank you.
Grazie David per questa introduzione di largo respiro, di prospettiva ampia che ci introduce perfettamente negli interventi che seguiranno. Adesso, prima di riprendere i lavori, prendiamo un